Here, the lovely Christine Leonard to speak tonight. Christine is an author of non-fiction and social history works, and particularly tonight she's going to talk about her family history, the Wall family, is that right? And who were convicts and came to Tasmania. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge country that Libraries Tasmania acknowledges, I've got to read it here, the deep histories and cultures of the people, Aboriginal people of Warrnambool. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respect to elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions and culture and knowledge of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries we never see. Over to Christine.
Thank you, Megan. I just have a short acknowledgement. As a visitor to Hobart, Nipaluma and the Huon Valley, I acknowledge Aboriginal people of Lutruwita as custodians of the country we are on this evening, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and the younger generation coming through. I might start off with a bit of background about me and how I got to write this family history. So family history has been an abiding interest on my mother's side of the family. My mother's older sister Lila was our family genealogist, and picking up on clues scrawled in the bottom of hard-to-read certificates, following up on rumours and innuendo being passed down, particularly through the women of our family. These were skills that my aunt had honed over the years. And as a young woman, I used to love hearing the stories of her discoveries, such as one of her trips to the Mitchell Library in Sydney, when she found that one of our ancestors, George Morrison, had served under Lieutenant John Bowen and came down on the HMS Lady Nelson and was part of the first white settlement at Risdon Cove for nearly a year. And after returning to New South Wales sometime in 1804 and following the repair of HMS Investigator, George was also on the Investigator, but it was after Matthew Flinders had left the colony, so I can't claim that. I have another interesting connection with Tasmania. Again, on my father's side, through his mother, my 3 times great-grandmother, Anne Simmons, came out as a convict with a little girl and landed in Hobart in 1823. So it was before there was the Cascades factory and all of that. And for many years, while she was an assigned servant, and I think after she got her freedom, she was running a house at 66 Melville Street, which is quite close to here. It's all under concrete now. I think there's a big car park and a Fitness First gym. We did a little tour around recently, and it was opposite the Nag's Head Inn, which I believe was quite an infamous watering hole, and Anne Simmons did have a bit of a reputation. So I've written a chapter about her, and I'm hoping it'll be accepted to go in the Convict Women's Press. They're planning another book with the theme about motherhood. In 2005, my Aunt Lila passed away, and not long afterwards I got a call from Rob, my cousin, and he said, Chrissy, I've got a few things here for you with instructions from Mum. And so I went around to where she had lived, and near the roller door in the garage were these 2 or 3 boxes and a couple of lever arch files of all my aunt's family history research. But that, of course, is on my mother's side, and that's yet waiting for me to do something about. Time passed, and up until recent years, I didn't know much about my father's Wall family, having been born in Papua New Guinea and living on remote plantations. So once I was sent to boarding school in Australia, I relied on relatives to visit me or take me in on school holidays. And that's when I really got to know my Wall grandfather, Ray Wall. He was a widower. He lived in a small beachside village called Imeo near Mackay in Queensland, and I would fly up on the May school holidays. Grandad Wall was the real old-timer sort. He used to drive out to the airport to pick me up, and I was embarrassed at the time because I thought his car was a very old jalopy. It was an Austin Roadster that he had started with a few vigorous turns of the crank handle, a two-seater, brown leather upholstery, a black soft top, and a dicky seat in the back for luggage and small children. And it was always unquestionably the oldest vehicle in the car park. Even in his dotage, my granddad walked and talked like a man of the land. He was defined by his life on stations, years in the saddle, droving cattle and sheep, and checking on boundary fences. And reflecting on family traits following my research of the Walls for the book, Ray Wall might have been a carbon copy of the male lineage that came before him. They were men of few words, more comfortable under an open sky, graceful on a horse, resourceful, short-tempered, emotionally remote. I am a fifth-generation descendant of William Wall, an 18-year-old groomsman who was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1835. So I set out to research and write about my dad's family because I lost him when I was 16, when he had a sudden heart attack. So I knew so much more about my mother's side, whereas having spent by then 7 years being educated in Australia, my dad and the Walls were more elusive characters of my imagination. So after conjuring memories of Dad through an adult lens, it became evident that there was much of my grandfather in my father. And as I embarked on tracing great uncles, aunts, great grandparents, certain traits kept reappearing. In 2018, when I started researching the Walls in earnest, one cousin led to another before I finally met Graham Wall, a distant cousin through our mutual 3 times great-grandfather William. After graciously, like my maternal aunt, Graham had been the Wall family historian for about 20 years. And the next 2 years of emails and phone calls, with COVID-19 intervening, we eventually met. And I went to his house armed with a laptop, notepad and pen, camera, and he graciously invited me in. So he led me down the hallway. I just sort of remember that first day. He led me down the hallway of his house and into this bedroom that was his office. And there was a sturdy desk, a desktop computer, a very good reading lamp, and a very good office chair. And I thought, oh, this is very good, you know. I got in the room and I turned around and looked at the 2 walls on either side of the door that we had just walked through, and floor to ceiling, tightly stacked, neat as a pin, was all the family history. And I just went, oh my, what a treasure trove. As a family historian, Graham had started the Wall Family Project long before emails became a thing. His research was exhaustive. No stone was left unturned as he investigated and examined the lives of all of William Wall's surviving currency children. The currency in our case being 13 children born free of ex-convict William Wall and 2 free settler women, in our Mary Long and Eliza Clark. So Graham and I descend from Mary, and so does Annie, and his husband, late husband, descend from William Wall. That was his first wife. So not only had Graham researched the second generation, but he also worked his way down 5, sometimes 6 generations. The currency thought of themselves as native-born Australians entitled to whatever resources and opportunities the land offered, without a thought of First Nations people who walked the same land for millennia and who, until colonisation, were its sole custodians. Graham should have been a professional archivist. Every letter and corresponding response was filed in a system any librarian would be proud of. The thing was, Graham loved the research, as I do. Only he set such a wide scope, a journey that took many fascinating and rewarding years. And as life worked around work and health, sometimes it gets in the way. And Graham had reached a point where the writing part just seemed a bridge too far. And that's a trap that can actually befall any of us if we start to embark on family history. So we struck a deal. Graham was happy to share his records and correspondence from the Warrnambool clan, and I would do the write-up. And I wondered, how on earth was I going to write about all these people? A cursory look through the files brought home to me how many had waited patiently for a story on their family, sometimes for more than 10 years. So there was no question of me just writing about my line. I couldn't do that. So I had to find a way of bringing Graham's vast scope of research into the light of day. And it was a daunting prospect. And I thought long and hard about how to structure a tale across so many branches of the walls. So I organised the book in 2 parts. And part 1 focuses on the circumstances in 1834 that led to William's transportation to Van Diemen's Land. This was when the first mystery arose, and that was about the family name Wall, or actually was it Lamb? So from the moment William was arrested, he used his mother's name Wall, sometimes spelt W-H-A-L-L, not Lamb, which was his father's surname. And so this is just something that remains speculation as to how and why that happened. William's father was a lace weaver, which is linked to the title of the book. So William was arrested during the annual horse fair in Horncastle, now a city, but once a Roman town, with evidence of earlier settlement dating back to the Bronze Age. And by the 1300s, Lincolnshire was the leading horse breeding district in the country, with most farmers breeding horses to sell at the Horncastle Fair. And according to the court clerk, because we went to the UK and, dragged Chris around country roads and archives and what have you, I read all the transcript of from the court clerk of the day. So William attempted to assault and rob a farmer, Mr. James Scrooby, and he was from a village called Belchford. So Mr. Scrooby had £60 in his pocket while in a crowd watching a fight in the back of the Vine Beer House in Horncastle. Now £60 in 1834, that is a lot of money. Scrooby's testimony against William was supported by a witness who was also a farmer from a nearby village who happened to be a constable. William denied the charges, of course, asserting that he was leaning over the man's shoulders to watch the fight when Scrooby turned around, grabbed him by the collar, accusing him of trying to rob him. William's defence case was weak. And in the book, I assumed that William, because I knew he was from Norfolk, I assumed that he was working for someone. He was 17 years of age. I assumed he was working for somebody in Lincolnshire as a groomsman, because that's what the occupation was on his arrest papers. I suspect he used his mother's name because he was frightened about what his father would say, but who knows. The internet is a marvellous thing though, and I wrote a blog about William's arrest, which prompted an email from a man in Horncastle called Kevin Woodward, and he was a member of the Horncastle History and Heritage Society, who was researching old pubs like the Vine Beer House and people who were transported out of the area. And he happens to live in Belchford. Well, he told me something very interesting about the horse fair. We've exchanged emails. He's still on the search of a couple of things for me. He thought it likely that William travelled from Norfolk to attend the horse fair, either to look after horses his boss was trying to sell, or more likely, look after the ones his boss had bought. People came from all over the country, from Europe, even the USA, to buy horses at the Horncastle Horse Fair. The main suppliers were local farmers and also the Irish, who walked their horses from Ireland to Horncastle. And there is still a country lane in a neighbouring county that is called Horncastle Lane, because that is one of the routes that the Irish used. But the Wall family, weaving the threads of memories, is essentially an Australian story. So I didn't include much of William's English history, except for his immediate family and their circumstances. Part 1 of the book follows William's life as an assigned servant in Tasmania, his freedom after 7 years, his marriage to Mary Long, and their move in early 1842 up north to Emu Bay to take up tenant farming with the Van Diemen's Land Company. Mary lost a child that year, a son, and the Walls were part of a wave of white settlers clearing forests and taking up farming tenancies in the area. By late 1842, the capture of the last remaining Aboriginal groups in the northwest was reported. Dr. Ian McFarlane asserts in his PhD thesis of 2002 that the genocide perpetrated against the Northwest tribes was part of the Van Diemen's Land Company's strategy, a significant and contributing factor in the near annihilation of First Nations people in that region. So part 1 of the book deals with William and Mary's accomplishments and challenges and their departure from Georgetown in 1846 for Port Phillip. They had another son by then. And Mary's death, a second marriage, and more about William's entrepreneurial exploits, ending with his passing in 1894. Part 2 of the book focuses on the currency, the 7 surviving sons of Mary Long, and the 6 male and female children of Eliza Clark. The paths they took as drovers, farmers, pastoralists, publicans, wives and mothers, and the 2 generations that follow. I was not going beyond 4. I structured the 13 family lines geographically. The Walls, in my experience, were not good at keeping in touch, whereas the families who lived, say, in the Wimmera or in Queensland tended to have some sort of connection with one another. So I thought that this might be more helpful for the descendants. And I also wanted the Wall story to engage readers not just with births, deaths and marriages, as Graham's files contain some fascinating letters and newspaper cuttings. And Trove is also a marvellous resource. So wherever possible, I've included their stories to give readers a better understanding of the social history that was unfolding in colonial Australia. This was actually a very interesting period in colonial Australia when you consider the 1854 Eureka Rebellion at Ballarat, the completion of 1872 of the Overland Telegraph Line, connecting Darwin to Port Augusta, the 1891 shearer strike in Barcaldine, Queensland, and a transport revolution that saw motor cars replacing horses and airplanes taking people into the skies. There's another puzzle that I haven't solved in Mary Long. We know that she was the daughter of a Captain William and Mary Long. William was a sea captain, and perhaps it was on his ship that Mary was born in St George's Sound near Liverpool, Lancashire in 1821. The details of her life in Van Diemen's Land are very sketchy, other than the description of Free on her marriage certificate and what is stated on her children's birth records, that her place of birth was at sea and that she was formerly Long. The informant of Mary's death registration was her son Joseph Lamb Wall. Now, the name Lamb crops up as a middle name in several Wall sons, because William actually tried to revert back to his father's name after he married and had a child. But it was all too late for that, because all his transportation papers, everything was Wall. So the name is honoured in many of the Wall sons, the name Lamb. When Mary died, Joseph Lamb Wall stated that his mother had lived in Tassie for 16 years, followed by 20 years in Victoria. So, assuming this is correct, she must have arrived in Van Diemen's Land in 1830. placing her at age 9. But I've had absolutely no luck in finding a matching record of a child named Mary Long arriving in Tasmania, nor a likely match to her parents. One of the granddaughters of William and Mary actually wrote to Graham in the early 1980s with a story about her grandmother, Mary. Wynne Phillips was sure that Mary was Mary and an unnamed sister were brought out to the colony as orphans by a Catholic priest. But I've found no evidence that Mary was ever in an orphanage, and I don't believe she was Catholic. Well, at least she wasn't buried in the Catholic section of Warrnambool Cemetery. In my research, I did find, however, a 16-year-old emigrant named Mary Long, who travelled alone to Van Diemen's Land, arriving in Launceston in 1836 under an assisted emigration scheme on the Amelia Thompson. And the passenger record states that this girl's date of birth was 1820, which is pretty close. And thanks to some of the research response that I've had from the library staff upstairs, this Mary Long found employment as a general servant for a Mr. Bullock who lived in Lake River in the Longford area. So now Longford's not that far from Launceston, which is where William was in his final assignment. So it's not beyond the realms of possibilities that that's how they met. Personal stories passed down through families are tantalising and most important, and they can't be ignored, but they unfortunately don't always resolve a clear outcome. The 1840s saw a depression spreading through the colonies. Australian wool prices in the London market plummeted, and grain, livestock and other commodities were also affected. The Wall sailed from Georgetown on the 29th of October 1846 on a 149-tonne brig Swan, called the Swan, for Port Phillip. And Stuart Wall believes that his grandparents brought with them a small breeding stock of sheep. William and Mary and their little child, Joseph Lamb, Wall, had spent about 10 months around Port Phillip, and then they left on another schooner for Lady Bay and the newly surveyed land of Warrnambool. With the town site still under thick scrub and timber, the Walls pitched a tent on an allotment near the eastern corner of Mary and Liebig Streets. And if anyone's ever been to Warrnambool, those names will ring a bell. They're very, very central. With very small savings, William started carting goods and produce to the gold diggings around Ballarat and Bendigo, and a somewhat dangerous undertaking, as hawkers and travellers were always susceptible to being held up by bushrangers. Gradually, William built up enough capital to buy a couple of blocks of land in the district. Their next child, named William Lamb Wall, surprise, surprise, was born in 1848 and purportedly was the first white male born in Warrnambool. In 1854, William purchased over 100 acres, about 8 kilometres from Warrnambool, and established a farm. The ensuing year saw him acquire more land, establishing a thriving business. He had a licensed inn called the Bush Inn, and we've been, what's left of it, I think horses have been living in, we know horses have been living in the building. So the Bush Inn catered for passing trade, and his establishment included a stockyard, a blacksmith, wheelwright shops, dairy, piggeries, and a 10-stalled horse stable. And he also established a racecourse. And I was interested in this because, he was a groomsman when he was, arrested. The connection with horses and the passion for racing and show jumping features in many Wall descendants. They rode horses for station work, they raced on country tracks, and they performed in the Sydney Royal Show. One granddaughter was approached by MGM to come back and screen test to be a double for leading ladies in some of the westerns, in the horse riding scenes. But Margot just could not bear the thought of leaving the land, so she declined. There's one of the sons, James Randolph, who's got a very interesting life. Two of his sons, though, died in horse accidents. My stepbrother, who was my father's son by his first marriage, was a driver and trainer in harness racing, and later acted as an agent buying horses for owners. And down the generations from William Wall, horses feature. And as a child, before I ever saw a horse in the flesh, I was obsessed with horses. Anna Sewell's novel, Black Beauty, I read and reread that book until the spine fell apart. The next 30 years saw William remaining in the hotel trade, losing his first wife from exhaustion, marrying one of two Irish sisters, Eliza Clark, who was a domestic servant in his establishment. Well, William did have a tribe of children in tow. And Eliza's sister, Mary Jane, married William's second eldest son, William Lamb, the one born in Warrnambool. And they had a tribe of children. So one of the interesting sons was from the currency was James Randolph. He was born in 1857, the year of the Indian Mutiny, and 9 years after Burke and Wills perished, Randolph, at age 13, was pulled out of school, I suspect because it was another boom and bust thing that William Wall had been through, and under the watchful eye of his older brother, Thomas Lamb Wall, they drove a mob of cattle into Queensland through the Cooper Creek, taking up large areas of land for the Victorian-born Hood brothers. They became the Hood brothers became very well known in Western Queensland, right down in the corner, and they were also a well-known. They had a pastoral run and all sorts of things in Victoria. So Thomas and Randolph, they followed the Paroo and Warrego rivers, links in a chain of waterholes, wells and billabongs, used by Aboriginal travellers since the dawn of time. You know, a lot of the pastoralists in Queensland would never have found the water sources if it wasn't for the information, the inside information that they got from Aboriginals as they went along. So Randolph's son Stuart mentioned in a letter in the 1980s to Graham that his father was the first white man to cross Cooper Creek with a dray. When William passed away in 1894, his sons by Mary were grown men. Their youngest, John Henry, or Jack, was my great-grandfather, and he was in his early 30s. William's children with Eliza ranged in ages from 16 to 25, and they lived with their father in Hexham, Victoria, until his death, because their mother had died when a lot of those children were very young, and they all worked in the what was the Woolshed Inn, became the Hexham Hotel, and we've been there. 7 grandsons served in World War I. One was killed in action in France. 8 great-grandsons served overseas during World War II, and another 4 enlisted in the Citizens Military Forces in Australia. And 1 great-granddaughter, my Aunt Beryl, was in the WAF, based in New South Wales. Jack Haycroft, one of the grandsons, he has an interesting story. He served in World War II in the Middle East and Greece, and he was captured and escaped twice, going missing for 19 months. And during this ordeal, he was sheltered by a lawyer with 3 children and another family who kept him hidden in a ceiling. And after he escaped the second time, the Germans discovered what the family had done and had them executed. Jack Haycroft went on to save 3 people by organising their escape, for which he was awarded by the King the Military Medal for gallantry and conspicuous bravery. There's a poem I'd like to read. It was written by Margaret Wall, Marty, who was Randolph's wife, and I just think it's just lovely. She actually wrote quite a bit, and she used to send them into magazines, and that was her sort of pocket money, because Randolph was very tight with the purse strings. Anyway, it's called Apple Pie. We were sitting in the kitchen, and you were busy as could be, for you were peeling apples to make a pie for me. and as you peeled a rosy one, o'er your shoulder you would fling the peel, to see the initial the peel would bring. And I felt awfully jealous, for it never formed a D, but always made a letter of any boy but me. So when your mother called you, I thought that I would try to make your clear initial so easy to make an I. And it made it, oh, quite simple, by adjusting it just so. And you never guessed I cheated, dear, so very long ago. 'Twas only just a bit of peel lying on the floor. I tried to look so innocent when you came through the door. Many an apple pie you've made for me since those old days, and grey is brushed upon our heads, all gone the childish ways. But often, as I sit and nod, or dozing in the sun, I think of you as you were then, my true mate, my loved one. So that's really the roundup of my war ancestors. I hope I would like the book to encourage people to get on and do their family's history, get the stories from the old people in their family and write it down, even if it's never put in a book. I mean, we can audio. I wish I had some audio interviews of people that I've now lost, and those things are so possible. And so I'd like to say thank you for coming, and a big thank you to the Hobart Library, Megan, for giving me this opportunity to talk about the Wall family. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
I've probably said it.
Sure, Christine will be willing to sign a book if you choose.
Yeah.
Christine, it
Yes.
sounds as though every person you've mentioned would have had a book
Yes.
of themselves.
Exactly.
In their own right.
That's right. And Randolph, really, there should be a book because he wrote a diary when he was about 17. He rode a horse with someone else from Rockhampton to Kalgoorlie in the late 1880s. It was uncontrolled land, and he wrote a diary of it, and I've read it. It's amazing. And but I had this struggle because there's some branches of the family where I didn't have much story to tell because they either didn't communicate with me or they didn't have it. They'd lost it. So there are.
How did you contain yourself? What sort of guidelines or fences
Well,
did you put around each story?
I don't think I did, really. I mean, I wrote what was available because Graham had collected all this information from people, and then people had died waiting for something. And and then I also tried to keep a balance. I didn't want to, I could have written pages and pages more about Randolph and that family out of Claremont. And, but, simply because the documentation was there. The stories were there, and Stuart Wall had written a lot, and he was communicating with Graham Wall in the early 1980s and that. And so he was very interested in his family history, and he was, wanting someone else to do it. Yeah. So, but it's a tough one, that, I think. Yeah.
And how have your sons and nieces and nephews, that next generation, responded to having a book with it all written down?
Yeah, look, they're all very interested, but like I was, when I was working, I remember saying to my aunt, I love family history, but I'm too busy at this time in my life to do anything about it, but I will do something when I get older. And I think that's what happens. I mean, I couldn't have taken this on when I was working. So I think, the main thing I wanted was to at least have it documented. And on the Leonard Stories website, I've got galleries of a lot of photos that the Wall family have sent in, and they can't all go in the book, but at least they're there so that if any of the family want to look at it, or anybody really, it's there. So
did you say you'd set up a website
yes,
around the
yes.
book?
Yeah, well, and I've done another book as well. I've just got 2 copies there. It's got nothing to do with Tasmania. I edited and published a memoir of a German priest who was 50 years on Bougainville, and he was captured by the Japanese and nearly was executed. It's quite an interesting story. But anyway, so I've got, and there'll be more. So it's not just about the Wall family, but there's a lot of photos and material that I've got on the walls, and the English history and all of that, that's not in the book, you know, it's sort of, and it's also, you think about the size, because there's the cost, more pages, more cost, and more weight in postage, all those things. So I tried to make it manageable, really, yeah.
Have you ever calculated how many descendants William Wall had?
Well, when I first looked at just a couple of the generations, I counted 116, and that was like, I think, 2 or 3 generations. I dare to think. Yeah.
Yes, Annie. What do you do with the information that you've received from the families that you haven't included in the book? What happens to
Well,
that?
a lot of it's on the website. I mean, there's a lot of documents I've still got to do more, but I've also said to people that quite a few of them, if they want to get in touch with other walls, to just contact me. I know who doesn't mind sharing their email, and so, you know, if they want to get in touch with other people, I'm quite happy to be a link for that. Yeah. But Graham is tearing his hair out because I'm not going to take it. He's wondering what is he going to do with all the hard copy of this, you know, and all the original letters. I mean, I went with my camera because I was just going to scan, digitise, and I said, Graham, that's your baby.
It has to go to the Mitchell Library.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it has to, because there's no one else that's really taking it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I've suggested to him, I've made a couple of suggestions to him. Yeah. So, that's about it, really.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
If anyone would like to get a newsletter from me, just put your email address on a little notebook there. I only do about 3 or 4 a year. I don't have a lot to say. So thank you very much for coming.
There's something